As we sit, tucked away in the ancient Central Pangaea mountain range, we'd like to offer you a warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, conspiracy theorists, interdimensional philosophers, seekers of truth, and last, but certainly not least, all of you with confirmation bias. You are listening to Musings on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix, our first ever live podcast show, broadcasted. Man, that voice crack kind of ruined the intro there. Broadcasted to Facebook and Instagram. We're usually a family-friendly podcast, and we tell you when we aren't, where we theorize the fourth dimension exists and is the spiritual dimension. And this is usually the part where I kick it over to Trace, but he forgot his script and we're using his phone.
Can't memorize it.
Yeah. Oh, well. So I'll read his part as we're dedicated to pushing science, logic, and the Socratic method to their limits as we discuss the mysteries and mythologies of the world. Only trigger warning for this episode is a logical conversation. So this episode is indeed family friendly. But if applying the Socratic method on fringe topics is disturbing to you, I'd advise you to turn off the podcast now.
Yeah.
Fish fact? Or no?
Oh, yeah. I completely forgot about that.
This is the part of the show where we usually have a fish fact, but apparently our marine biologist is unprepared.
I spaced out.
Flopping around on the deck. Shall we just skip the fish fact for today?
No, I got one.
You always have a fish fact prepared.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
I can't remember if I've done this before. Have I done a moray eel yet?
Yes, because I made the joke about the song when the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie. That's a moray eel.
So I'm pretty sure it's called a snipe eel that has the most vertebrae of any animal. It has, I think, over 700 vertebrae in it.
Wow.
It's like a somewhat deep sea eel.
Could you imagine having back problems as that?
Yeah.
But
can you imagine the back crack on that?
That would be, my joints crack so much. It's just offensive to me that like with all the cracking it does, my body doesn't glow like a glow stick, like ever. So, all right. So today is a special show. Number one, because we are doing a live show, a live broadcast here. But number two, we also have a special guest with us who has a PhD in history, 4 master's degrees. I was hoping you were going to actually list out the master's degree so I could read it off and be super official, but that's all right. He's a professor at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, author of 3 books on the topic of World War I. He's published over 50 articles on diverse subjects, largely pertaining to military history, I assume.
Yep.
30 years in the Army, retired as a full bird colonel. 12 moves, 12 years out of the country, 4 combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. One of the highlights we're going to talk about in this show later on after we discuss history with you is going to be your experiences in Desert Storm. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, our guest is indeed that old.
Wait a second.
Joke's on you. We're going to throw roasts around. He's a senator for the 33rd PA District of Pennsylvania. I'm not going to elaborate on that because we have 2 rules for this podcast, that there's no profanity and there's no politics. So I will mention his political service and leave it at that. This show is not a support or a lack of support for political stances in any means. We stay apolitical here. So, that being said, the final credential is that it's my dad. So,
Most importantly.
So it might be kind of hard to tell us apart at times for those of you listening.
It's true.
So I'll apologize. The one that says the smart things is not me.
That's debatable.
I don't know about that. At least smart things in pertaining to history. How about that? So, Trace, before we actually get into having our guest elaborate and delve into his point here, let's talk a little bit about the show for those that are tuning in on the lives here, because we have a lot of followers for the podcast, social medias that haven't yet tuned in to actually listen to the podcast, which is available on Spotify, Apple podcasting platform, YouTube, pretty much anywhere you can go to find a podcast. And they can find this show here. So, I mean, we touch on it a little bit in the actual introduction of the show, but what is the podcast Musing on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix, and why the heck do we have such a long name?
So, we're trying to compare. I think the original premise was try to compare mythology, and we got a little off topic on that a little bit.
Oh, yes.
But we're trying to get back into that. But basically, what we're trying to do is we're trying to talk about all the weird stuff that happens in our world and how we can connect it to science and basically just linking spirituality and science and mythologies and talking about history, everything along those lines.
Well, to talk about mythology, we got to talk about history, and who better to have explain history to us and wrap up our discussion on the Bible and to start us off on analyzing other myths. But we do also indeed, so I mean, I chose the name for the podcast for a very specific purpose. So musings is to think, to logically speculate on mysteries. So we analyze mysteries of the world, such as things like 411 and sea monsters and things like that. And the mythical matrix. So a matrix is kind of an interweaving pattern that underlies everything. And so there's a mythical matrix that exists when you look at mythology, and that's why you have the subject of comparative mythology. And so that is a nod to our study of that topic. And finally, we chose something that has 4 M's because we theorize from a scientific perspective that the fourth dimension, not time, because that is sometimes quantified as the fourth dimension for mathematical purposes, but that is in of itself not actually the fourth dimension. We theorize the fourth dimension exists and could be the spiritual, and that would explain a lot of things that we see, like UFOs, which is going to be one of our future topics we have coming up in the coming months. And then we are, I just got totally derailed on my train of thought there. I haven't had enough caffeine today, but that's a good taste. So if you're interested to go listen to the back catalog, this is episode 19. So we have 17. Episode 18 releases this Wednesday. So we're transcending time, releasing this episode early for you Facebook and Instagram Live listeners, viewers. But for the rest of you, you're going to have to wait until September 11th is when this episode will release on Spotify, Apple Podcast platform, YouTube, everything else. Our guest also has some slides I'll put onto the YouTube. So if you just give me a nod whenever you're changing the slide deck so I can put a timestamp in there, make my life a whole lot easier. Thank you much. Trace will be able to see the slides. I can't. Actually, no, I have them on my computer, so I'm good. Just kidding.
I feel like seeing the slides might actually help me because
there you go. See,
part of my issue is following along with whatever you're saying.
That's
so now
fair.
I can actually follow along.
Now you have a visual guide. There you go. All right. Well, Colonel, I guess I'll call you Colonel rather than Dad or Pops. It seems a little bit more professional for a podcast. So, Colonel, over to you. Thanks for joining us today. And
Thank you.
What do you have for us?
So, all the episode talk reminded me of a quote from Galaxy Quest. You're the first to see episode 88, two-parter. We watched that a lot in France in the Argonne.
It's true. We certainly did.
So, I mean, thanks for having me on. I love history. I see value to it. A lot of people don't see value. Back when I was in Stuttgart, I think, I was on a streetcar and was in a polite conversation in German with this guy. And he's like, so what do you do for a living? You know, so I asked him that first because I'm an engineer. And he's like, politely says, okay, what do you do? He goes, I don't want to say I'm here, as a soldier. So I was actually on my way to an archive, the Baden-Württemberg archive in Stuttgart. And I said, I'm a historian. And he's, being, from the STEM, he's like, ha, what a waste. You can't do anything with history. What a joke. And then I reminded him, because I'm sure glad that those of our forefathers that fought against the Nazis in World War II knew history, because after World War I, the victors beat down Germany. The French and British beat down Germany, extorted them, tore them apart financially, militarily. So in World War II, the Americans we're not going to do that because that created conditions for the Nazis and Hitler. And instead, we came with a Marshall Plan and rebuilt Germany and Japan, made them our friends. And he goes, whoa, I never thought of that. Yeah, no kidding. So, I'm on use and abuse of history. So who cares? I have a lot of points here. I'm not going to hit them all. Provides your identity, explains how you got here. You could reflect on it on do's and don'ts on how people fell into war in World War I, how they fell into war in World War II, the lack of clarity. Desert Storm, the first war I fought in April of, it was the early summer of 1990. Saddam Hussein, who was then the dictator of Iraq, approached the American ambassador because he had eyes on attacking Kuwait. And April Glaspie, our ambassador, was asked by Saddam Hussein what she thought about, conflict with Kuwait. And she gave an ambiguous answer that the Bush administration, wasn't interested in inter-Arab conflict. I'm paraphrasing. That lack of clarity. Had she said, no, we want status quo, no, you cannot attack Kuwait, you cannot touch Saudi Arabia, I think Saddam Hussein would not have invaded. But that lack of clarity, he invaded, and he was shocked when we started deploying the 82nd Airborne and the Marines and others to take back, to liberate Kuwait. So you see those accidental lapses. Had the British in July of 1914 been clear to the German ambassador that they would intervene and defend the integrity and sovereignty of Belgium, I believe World War I would not have happened. But Lord Grey, who was the foreign secretary for the British then, when he was speaking with the German ambassador, he gave some vague answer like April Glaspie did in 1990 with Saddam Hussein. So you have these people stumbling into war. So people from the STEM programs, you're important. It's scientific. It's demonstrable what you do. I believe my lab is the path to, not subject to interpretation, subject, of course, to misapplication or maybe not fully accurate, but generally used as a laboratory so we could see human responses to certain things within the context of their culture and religion and worldview. But then perhaps we could avert other misunderstandings and wars.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point, especially since we just did 3 episodes on science and 1 on quantum physics, that it's a very valuable and quantifiable field, but that we also have history that we have to look at, and we can't just dismiss history out of hand. And I think a lot of people do, and how they build their worldviews is that they'll just look at science and say, oh, we have these supposedly infallible dating methods, and we have all this other supposedly infallible science, and they'll ignore a whole field and discipline of study and not see what that field has to offer and not consider it fully. So I definitely agree with you there. I'd also agree that as we're wrapping up an analysis, for those of you tuning in, we're wrapping up an analysis of the Bible and did a deep dive interlinear study of the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And we're asking the question, since so many people take the Bible seriously as the inerrant word of God, is the Bible viable or is it made up? Is there something polluted in here? And we've had another guest analyzing that from more of a logical, scientific, apologetics perspective, and then that's why you're here, is to kind of lead us, wrap up that conversation with a nice bow for us, and then move us into looking at the broader context of what does history in general have to offer about the past of the world, and how this may contradict what science sometimes says, and how to analyze it. And context is key. People love to take stuff out of context all the time, and it's a huge issue. And I'm sure you know much more about this than I do, but the historical perspective and the historical context of certain Bible verses drastically changes the meaning of them oftentimes, does it not?
It does, and that reminds me of the famous English poet from around 1710. He wrote A Little Knowledge, and his name is Alexander Pope. So that's his name, Alexander Pope. He said, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. And he goes on to say, drink deep of the springs of Perea, the springs of wisdom from Greek mythology. And he's like, so you might watch something online, you might see something, a clip on TikTok or something, and you'll take it for face value. And he's like, no, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Dig deep. Find out if there's historic background backing up, archaeological evidence. Is there anything left, physically that you could see and touch, of whether Babylon was real or not?
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to name drop here someone I have an issue with. This is not an endorsement from Colonel Mastriano. This is my personal pet peeve. Billy Carson, recent guest on Joe Rogan. Trace is laughing because he knows. Billy Carson is the perfect example of that, where he'll throw out a little bit of knowledge and he'll act like an expert. He'll act like someone that knows exactly what he's talking about. But if you just go look at the mythology texts and what they actually say, it's very clear that he's never read them himself, or that he has read them and he's intentionally trying to deceive. I don't know which, but he gets his details wrong. It's clear he has a surface level knowledge, and he'll contrast things incorrectly from like Sumerian myth to the biblical account. And he'll talk about things like higher criticism, which I know he doesn't say that in name, but you've identified that. And so we're going to talk about that later on in the show as well. Trace, I'll let you have the final comment here before we take a brief pause for an ad, because you've not said almost anything since your fish fact.
I mean, hey, everyone's contributing a lot more than what I can, but I think with the Billy Carson stuff, I think that he likes to dwell on his own thoughts a little more than the information in front of him. Like he'll read a little bit and then he'll go off on a tangent in his own mind and make connections by himself without making connections at with the documents and mythologies.
Yeah. Well, it blows my mind because he apparently He wrote a book on quantum physics as well, and he doesn't even understand the double slit experiment. He got that wrong. We've discussed that in the previous
Ghostwriter.
I don't know, man. It's sketchy. Anyway, we're going to take a brief ad break. For those of you live, you'll just get to see us awkwardly stare at each other, gaze into each other's eyes here. For those of you that are listening to the podcast after the fact, you get to hear a brief ad. And we are back. Ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, conspiracy theorists, all of you out there, we thank you for tuning in, whether you're tuning in live or you're quantumly transcending the dimensions of time and listening to the show after the fact. We thank you so much for your patronage. Again, for those listening live, you can find us on Spotify, YouTube, all your podcasting platforms, Musings on Mysteries, and the Mythical Matrix. I know that's a mouthful. I apologize. It's a reason for the name, as we've explained. So, that being said, I'm going to kick over the show to our guest once again. Colonel, what do you have for us?
As far as history, when we were in Israel for the first time, I was struck that we did not meet anyone in Israel, whether Christian, Jew, or Muslim, or nothing at all, that did not deny the existence of Jesus. I come back to America and I see podcasters and others, some that you may have even quoted, that deny his existence. And so they might not believe, what he stood for and what Christians believe that he was, Lord and Savior and King. But they acknowledge historically, they look around, there's evidence all around them. And so it's so important to understand history and archaeology and how these, either confirm or deny something that you might know, that you might believe is a myth or not. Yeah. There was please.
I just recently saw something. I don't know how true it is. I didn't dig into it at all. But I just saw something that apparently there's records of Jesus visiting in like some Buddhist temple. I don't know.
I cannot speak to that.
That's a Billy. I'll tell you right now. That's a Billy Carson claim. I've seen him claim that, so I would automatically take that one with a grain of salt.
Just making crap up.
Just be forewarned on that one. Now, again, I'm not gonna say that it's an absolute proof or disproof, because that's an appeal. That's a variant of the appeal to authority logical fallacy to say that just because of the source of a claim that it is in of itself true or false. Yeah, well, so I'm not gonna.
There's a theory that Jesus was like a real guy, but what he actually was is he was a guy that traveled to like Buddhist cultures, got their knowledge, and then came back and spread that information around, and then everyone took it as like, oh, this guy knows what he's talking about.
Yeah, and so I'd have to actually we'll have to investigate that at some point later on the show. Cool. But
so that brings us to the historic method then. So methods to disconnect people, of course, is ignorance or rewrite history, and this might be revisionism or rewriting history, because I think we're going to get into this later on, is the sourcing. How close? Okay, so let's say that Billy has a source, and then how old is that source? Does it go back? Is it contemporary or near contemporary to Jesus' life on earth and to the disciples on earth? Or is it something that came up 600 years, 1,000 years later? And how accurate can that be? Me, as a veteran 33 years ago or so from Desert Storm, my remembrance of the events closer to the time obviously have a lot more clarity. And then when I look at a journal that I kept, I was like, oh, I forgot that. So there's, even in our own lifetime, there's reinterpretation and, and forgetting the details of situations, remembering parts of highlights and forgetting other significant events. And so, either ignorance or rewriting. And we're seeing a lot of rewriting in our time. So when somebody makes a claim like that, I'd ask you to go through a critical thinking exercise, what's the credibility of the source? How close to the source is the event? Do other outside contemporary sources confirm or deny? So, okay, we have the Bible, we have archaeology, and then, on top of that, do you have outside sources, confirming or denying whether that's accurate or not? And what kind of archaeological, physical evidence exists? So I would assert that there's no evidence to that assertion, from Billy or whoever's coming up, that Jesus was, jet setting around the world. They're bringing Eastern ideology to the Middle East. We see something actually fulfillment of Jewish prophecy.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. You have to look at what the sources are for such a claim. And I haven't looked at the sources. This is something you're just bringing up. So it'll be something we'll have to explore. But you're going to be hard pressed to find evidence for that. something else, because let's tangent off of this a little bit, because we regularly take tangents here. We take the derivative of things and explore them, and then we'll take the integral back and come back to the main premise of the show. But let's explore that a little bit, because I know some people will talk about the gap of time from Jesus. So in the Gospels, we're only given Jesus's experiences, I think, like 12 or 13, like up to that point, approximately, with some gaps. And then we have a gap of about 20 years. And some people will argue he went to Egypt in that time. Some people argue he went to India and learned Enlightenment techniques and things from the Near East. Some people even, such as another Instagram account I have an issue with, Reasoned Reality, that is neither reasoned nor grounded in reality, as they regularly adhere to logical fallacies, will throw around that is reason to question the whole validity of the biblical account in of itself, because 20 years are missing from Jesus's life. So how would you respond to something like that as a master historian?
So critical thinking obviously is key. And how do you secure the skill set to think critically? And it's obviously being widely read. So, reading a broad array of sources there, exposing yourself to history and other people's commentaries, understanding logical fallacies as well, so you can identify them. Maybe not discount somebody's argument because they fall to fallacies, but seeing if the meat and context is relevant. I think, for this part here, I'm going to focus in on the slide with all the books on top. And so, as my third master's degree was the Jedi Air Force course called the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies. And we called it a book a day club. The first half of the course was every day was 250 pages of reading. Wednesday was a reading day, so 1,000 pages a week. And so I actually read several of the books over the summer breaks and took notes, and so I could keep up. But one of the books we read was by Thucydides, the Peloponnesian Wars. So this is the war between Athens and Sparta.
Right.
It was
300, right?
Yeah. Yeah, around that time, and Thucydides was one of the Athenian generals, and so he wrote this book. And when we were studying Thucydides, not one of us in this advanced, very selective course, is one of two Army officers with the Air Force there, and there's about 25 Air Force officers, the best of the best for them. And none of us questioned the veracity of Thucydides. We knew he wrote it. But here's the challenge. So what's the oldest manuscript we have? How close to him do we have a manuscript? Or documents or fragments,
like written word.
Yeah,
I think I just heard our English teacher was just talking. My English professor was just talking about this, that they just discovered a couple weeks ago the oldest manuscript, even older than it's some Sumerian tablet that's just a beer record of his store, like an inventory of his beer.
I've heard about this from some years ago, actually.
No, this is like new.
Oh, is it new?
There's
okay.
The oldest before that, I think, was is like a formal complaint against a copper.
Yeah, that's
salesman.
what. Okay, yeah. So an order for beer. It sounds about right. But no, I think what our guest is talking about is more proximity of writing to an event. Correct? Yeah. Not specifically the oldest document ever. So just to clarify,
and so Thucydides was fighting with against the Spartans, and his document that none of us question whether it's accurate or not. The oldest manuscript we have is 1,300 years after his existence. 1,300, but yet we don't question it.
Right.
For Julius Caesar, his Conquest of Gaul, I meant to bring a copy of it down here. We study that book as well, and really it's a propaganda pamphlet. It describes historically how he conquered Gaul, modern day France. But it's really a propaganda document for him, because he had political aspirations. I believe that's my interpretation. But the oldest and closest event we have to him was 1,000 years after he was dead. So 1,000 years later, that's the oldest. But none of us, and there's 10 of those documents that exist, and none of us question that Julius Caesar actually wrote it. Homer, which we often use to quote for ancient discussions, the oldest document to him that we have 500 years after he was dead. So that's like saying that somebody in the 1500s, passed away, and today something that I write a biography on this figure, that's that's you're like, wow, So, but when it comes to the Bible, they want to question it, and we have Herodotus 1,300 years later, Pliny 750 years later, Roman historian. Nobody questions that their works are theirs. For the New Testament, I'm going to focus on the Old Testament with the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I know you brought up. There's no question about the veracity of the Old Testament and the accuracy of those, especially with Isaiah and others, because they have those Dead Sea Scrolls. We were there, Qumran, near the Dead Sea.
So let me pause you for a second here. I have a quick question. So when you're talking 500, 700 years after the event, you're talking about these being written at this time, or are you just talking about the oldest manuscript that we have dating to 700 years after?
These are the oldest manuscripts we have with Caesar's name on it.
Okay.
But written 1,000 years after.
Okay, so oldest document we have in relation to proximity of the source, that not that this was written literally, like I was, like me going and writing a documentary on Shakespeare. This is like, hey, now, like the newest or the oldest document we have about Shakespeare being found like now in 2024, that kind of thing.
So the assumption is historically, so these are obviously rewrites or reprints or what have you,
right.
Manuscripts written, but we're believing they're copies of Caesar's original work. So it's copies of copies, but they're dating 1,000 years after. So it's not documents that were discovered that where he wrote, or we don't have any original source documents going to him or Thucydides or Homer or Pliny or Herodotus.
Okay, so it's like people in the year 3000 finding a book on Romeo and Juliet and published in 2024.
Yes,
and that's the most recent source that they have in relation to Shakespeare existing, but they don't question Shakespeare.
Exactly.
Okay, gotcha.
So for the New Testament, Old Testament, no problem. So we have manuscripts or parchments or fragments left that could be as old as 10 years to the event.
For the Old Testament or for the New?
For the New Testament.
Okay.
For the Old Testament, I'm just relying on his Dead Sea Scrolls. There's many, many more. There are other religions in the world that a caliph would call all the manuscripts together and burn or destroy all the ones that he didn't like because they didn't reflect the one that he liked. This never happened. So you could go and verify whether or not the New Testament and Old Testament are accurate based off the sources. So Caesar, 1,000 years after the event, no problem. We accept it as his word. New Testament, we have fragments and documents 10 years or 100 years after the fact. So contemporary or near contemporary. So here's a copy of the St. John fragment from Egypt. It's part of a papyrus that survived that has parts of John chapter 18. They didn't use chapters back then, but in our John chapter 18. And you go through and interpret these Greek words, which I do have here on this paper, and confirm or deny whether our translation of John 18 are accurate. This is within the lifetime of some of the people that actually witnessed Jesus and the spread of the gospel to Egypt. And so there's no question, whether you believe or not, the content is a different thing, but the historic accuracy. So is close to 10 to 100 years after the fact. There's 24,000 sources altogether that confirm the New Testament. 24,000 ancient manuscripts, documents, fragments, parchments, 5,000 of which are Greek, 19,000 that are Latin, Hebrew, or Aramaic.
So there's really no question, at least in regards to the New Testament, from a historical perspective, that anyone came along within the years 200 to 1900s and rewrote massive sections of the New Testament in any way, shape, or form. There is zero grounds for such a claim whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, once again, whether you believe it or not, it's a different thing. But accepting it as a viable, it's the most concrete, substantiated ancient document that exists anywhere in the world that can be verified from outside sources. And so, what you do with that is irrelevant. The fact is that it is very accurate, and we take for granted Caesar, Thucydides, Homer, Pliny, Herodotus, and accept their works even if some of the documents are 500 to 1,300 years after. So that'd be like, as you rightly said, so, with Shakespeare, finding a republication today rather than anything closer to the source, that'd be a whole different can of worms here. And so we're okay with outside things being not verifiable, but for some reason, the test, this was a big find. I think this was in the 60s, this fragment here from Egypt. Because you can go right to the source and see, wow, this is near contemporary, and wow, it's accurate.
So what would you say about like smaller changes that are made?
So that's one thing. So, I speak German, and even in German is close to English because, of course, the Saxons, after the fall of Rome, were invited by the original inhabitants of southern Great Britain to help them fight each other, and the Saxons, with the northern Germans, decided to stay. And so, English is influenced and corrupted by, German, by Danish and Norwegian, because, of course, the Norsemen came and settled as well. And it's also influenced by French and Latin because, of course, William the Conqueror came from France in 1099. And so, even I say all that because German and English, there's some parallels thanks to the Saxons. House in German is house in English. Mouse in German is mouse in English, There's differences, of course. Like hospital is French hospital, but in German, what's a hospital?
Krankenhaus.
So there are differences. We could do this butterfly as well.
Yeah, Schmetterling. Papillon, French.
So when you're translating, even from a language that's close to our language, there still is a problem. So there might be differences. So that if you're really serious about it, then learn ancient Greek or Hebrew or ancient Hebrew or Aramaic to really get to the meat of what it's saying. But with the documents we have here, like the St. John fragment, looking at this, in its ancient language, what we have in English, I'm seeing is pretty darn close to what this is saying.
Yeah. So it's really hard to translate something word from word when we're taking it from another language, especially something as far removed from us as Hebrew is, which you were at the Defense Language Institute. Hebrew is a category 3 or 4 language. Can you remind me in terms for English?
Category 3.
So for those that aren't familiar, category 3 there's 4 categories on a scale of 4 being the hardest, 1 being the easiest for English speakers to learn. I think we hit our time limit for Instagram.
Hold on. No, that's just my phone.
Oh, is that your phone?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, you have a limit so you don't abuse social media too much?
Yeah.
I gotcha. Okay. But so let's circle back here.
Someone's asking about Q&A.
So apparently we have some people wanting to do Q&A. So tell you what, we'll take a brief ad break here from the recording itself. I'll take a look at some of these streams and see what we've got going on. All right, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, we have decided we are going to attempt to take some questions on the fly. We're going to use the ad breaks to consolidate this. So no questions yet, but for those of you that are watching live, if you have any questions on the topics we are discussing, please feel free to interject or email us at m.quad.musings@gmail.com, and we will do the best that we can to keep up. So that being said, talking about categories of languages. So category 1's the easiest to learn, or would that be English itself?
So from English, Spanish, Italian, French.
And those are category 1?
They're easiest for English speakers. So it's a 24-week course, and that's easiest for us to learn. Category 2 would be German.
Okay. And then you go up to category 3, and that's like Hebrew and all of that.
Greek, Turkish.
Russian. And then Chinese, Japanese would be category 4?
Yeah.
Okay. So for those of you out there, so you have a little bit of understanding, and he was a commander at the Defense Language Institute, so he would definitely be an expert of understanding of that kind of training atmosphere from the U.S. Army. So Hebrew being a category 3 language, we have to consider that Hebrew, for one, reads right to left and not left to right like we do, but there's also extreme grammatical differences to where if we translated it literally word for word, it would make no sense conforming to our grammar. So for those of you that are bilingual, you know exactly what I'm talking about. For those of you that only know one language, this isn't to discriminate against you by any means, but there is huge differences there you're not going to understand unless you can speak another language, which I can speak German. My dad can also speak German, the Colonel. But you have huge differences. If you're interested to explore some of those nuances in the semantics, translating from one language to another, we actually did a analysis of Hebrews 1 through 11, or oh my gosh, geez, that made no sense. Hebrews, a interlinear Hebrew analysis of Genesis 1 to 11 on the show. It's like episodes 2 through 8 or something like that. Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts. You can go listen to us analyze the original Hebrew there as we had it available from Strong's Interlinear Concordance. So, Trace, you had something you wanted to interject, so over to you.
Yeah, so in terms of the mistranslating stuff, I think people like to focus on the small mistranslations, and then they'll kind of invalidate it in their own head for the entire thing.
Oh yeah, I have something I'm going to get into on that one too. Just today, the Logical Fallacies account, Reason to Reality, posted something about a supposed contradiction from the New Testament I want to address. But back over to the Colonel so we don't get too derailed on tangents.
Yeah, and that's just so splitting hairs. So there actually are Bibles out there that are word for word translations from the Greek or the Hebrew or Aramaic, depending on which book in the Bible you're doing. I mean, so you have many authors over a couple thousand years or so, several thousand years actually. But there's congruency, and so if you have questions about specific words and interpretation, then get the Bible that's word for word, and it'd be hard for an English speaker to read because it's trying to take something that, as Josiah rightly said, writes in the opposite direction and puts it down in our language. But I think for most or at least several of the modern translations, you can rely upon them since we have so many ancient fragments and manuscripts, Dead Sea Scrolls, that really seals the deal in the entire Old Testament here, that you can rely upon as what you're reading is what the actual source has. So, for clarity here, so I have I'm building on a stool 3 legs, for my argument. The first one we just went over is how close are the sources to the event, and I think we demonstrated clearly that the Bible sources are just amazingly ancient and close to the source of the event. So you can rely upon the book as it exists, as it is written. This is despite interpretations and what have you. But once again, you can always go to the source. The second leg, of course, is outside contemporary sources. So it's one thing to have somebody come here and say, I had a vision, an epiphany, and all the other religions, are no good. This is not Christianity talking here, but I'm here with a new revelation. But then you have no other contemporary sources, verifying what this person is saying. And the third leg is archaeological evidence. So let's get to the next one here: outside contemporary sources. So we have, of course, one Roman writer that existed not too long after Jesus, Cornelius Tacitus, said, here's a quote from Tacitus. So this is an outside source, not a Bible source, not a Christian. He was writing about Nero's reign. Nero had a very dramatic reign that included the burning of Rome. And of course, some people speculate Nero wanted to burn the old city down so he could rebuild it in his image. And he needed a scapegoat. He wasn't real popular, so he blamed the Christians. And Cornelius Tacitus, not a Christian, near contemporary source, said Christians by the populace, Christus they were called, Christians, from whom the name had the origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So he's talking about, he's mentioning as an aside the Christians. So that's a near contemporary affirmation that this is not something created by somebody's imagination. And this was written between 69 and 96 AD. So this is near contemporary, and he's writing about the reign of Tiberius as well as Nero. Another near contemporary source was Flavius Josephus. A lot of Christians, of course, quote him, rightly so. He was a first century Jewish historian and an apologist. He was actually part of the Jewish rebellion and uprising against the Romans. And his work, he constantly mentions the existence of Jesus and his followers. So he was born in Jerusalem just a couple years after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, and he died in Rome around 100 AD. And here's what Flavius Josephus, not a follower of Jesus, but a historian contemporary to the times, said, "At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous, and many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps a Messiah concerning whom the prophets had recounted wonders." That's a contemporary of the Christians and Jesus, writing, historically. So these are outside sources. So first I said, look, the source is reliable because we have all these ancient manuscripts, documents, fragments, parchments to affirm that the accuracy of the Old and New Testaments. It is, unlike Caesar's conquest of Gaul, unlike Thucydides and the Peloponnesian Wars. We have so many. I don't know how many of these near contemporary sources you want me to go over. We have Gaius Suetonius also saying, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Christus, Christ, Claudius expelled the Christians from Rome, and and he was 120 AD, a historian. We have Thallus to most English speakers, affirming the existence of Jesus and Christians. I could read these quotes here. I don't want to pontificate. You guys want to jump in and ask any questions?
Trey, say something smart. I need to make some notes.
Oh man, on the spot again. It is kind of interesting to see all these accounts like just a few years after it all happens, and they're kind of collaborating with it all.
That's exactly what the point of this here is. Yeah. So, first we say, is the manuscript of the Old and New Testament, can it be relied upon to be what was written originally? And yes, it can, with 24,000 manuscripts, parchments, fragments for the New Testament alone, not even describing tens of thousands for the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. When Thallus wrote, he was the first, perhaps the earliest non-Christian writer to refer to Jesus, and what he describes actually is reflected in the Gospels. He wrote, this Roman, this actually Greek historian during the time of Rome, because on the whole world there pressed a most fearsome darkness, describing the crucifixion. And the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness, Dallas wrote in his third book of the history, and he describes it an eclipse of the sun. It's like, wow. So not only are we having affirmation of the existence of Pontius Pilate, which until 1962, many secular archaeologists and historians said he was a mythological figure. He never existed. He was a creation. They denied these outside sources, but then, we'll get to that later on, there was a find in Caesarea that we'll discuss later on. So I discussed, we have Pliny the Younger, 112 AD, affirming the existence of Jesus and Christians. Mara bar Serapion, 73 AD. Lucian of Samosata, 166 AD. Celsus, 175 AD. Phlegon, 140 AD. They all have separate quotes, not borrowing from other historians, where they affirm the existence of Jesus and the rise of the Christians. That would wrap up the discussion of the near contemporary sources discussion.
You seem like you have something burning on your conscience, Trace. Why don't you share it with us?
I'm trying to think.
Our goal here is to also play the Socratic method, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers. And the Socratic method, for those of you that aren't familiar, which is playing the other side of the argument. So it comes from Socrates' method, where he would ask questions, and then he would flip-flop kind of back, and he would ask questions from the other side and try to poke holes in an argument that someone would take.
Yeah.
So that's kind of our intent here, is to have a little bit of back and forth discussion on all of this. So Trace, do you have anything, or do you want me to? Because I know what some of the mainstream arguments would be against this.
I mean, why are they so valid, even though they're like at least 100 years after it? Because you were saying stuff like 170 AD, stuff like that. So that's a good while after it. So are they just talking about just like the rise of Christianity, or like why are they so valid in speaking on Jesus did exist?
Yeah, so let's talk about Gaius Suetonius, a Roman historian. And so what was his book about? And his book was called The Lives of the Caesars, and basically his book was a brief recounting of the first 12 Caesars, which of course goes through the time of Jesus and early, but predates Christianity as well, though. And so his point was not to serve as an apologist for Christians. He was not a Christian, but to recount the history. And so as he's recounting, he's seeing the rise, of Jesus, and Pontius Pilate's dealing with him, and the trouble that thanks to Nero, actually Claudius, Nero's stepdad. He believed that some of the troubles in Rome were being caused by people of the Jewish faith, so that's why he kicked them out of Rome. And that's actually mentioned in the book of Acts as well in the New Testament.
So it's just as viable as like a historian writing today about World War I, pretty much.
Yeah, so for me, obviously, Josiah mentioned my 3 books are all World War I, histories. Yeah. And so for those, I don't know if these guys went to libraries like the Library at Alexandria or Ephesus, were massive libraries that existed that had scrolls that you could. So they had archives back then, in effect. And so when I wrote, thankfully I speak German, I was able to go to the German archives and unearth the truth of what happened 100 years ago as I'm working on these books here. And so you're seeing me pull out, segments of this. So whether Suetonius did that or not, I don't know. For Josephus, being a Jew, living in Israel and, in Jerusalem as well, being part of the Jewish rebellion against the Romans, not too long after Jesus there, he actually has a first-hand account of how the Christians are treated, in Judea specifically.
Okay.
Yeah,
no, that's a good question. So some people, I know what kind of the other side of the argument is, because I've been trolling the internet via our social media platforms to one of my toxic red flags is I love arguing with strangers on the internet, at least sometimes.
Sometimes.
It's
a little more than sometimes.
Can't call me out on a live like that, man. Come on. All right. So some people would argue, so there's 2 points I'll bring up as potential counters I'll let you address. So number one, people would bring up that the direction of the Gospels seems to be more theological than historical, and that could be grounds to question the historical validity of the Gospels claim. So that's the first one. How would you respond to that?
I mean, I think that's a red herring argument. I mean, so you discounting something because it's overtly religious. And, I know that in my own life, one of my books is being attacked because a lot of Alvin York's Christian faith comes out. And I think that's a red herring. So why do I say that? So, okay, we have most of the New Testament was written by St. Paul, at least the letters. And so it's letters to the various churches around the Mediterranean and Asia Minor, Turkey. And, he's capturing a moment in time and addressing theological and other issues, and persecution that the new Christians are facing in this Roman Empire. And so discounting that because it's, religious, quote unquote, in its manner, I don't think it's honest, because then let's discount and write off Caesar's conquest of Gaul, because that, I believe, is a political pamphlet for him to become popular, because he is a great general defeating the powerful Gallic armies, which they were powerful, and capturing Vercingetorix and all this other stuff. It was a propaganda, so it's understanding that. But we accept Caesar's conquest of Gaul because historically those events did happen. Those people he described did exist. And it's similar and even more accurate with the New Testament. Those people, circumstances, locations actually existed, and there's archaeological evidence. You go to Ephesus, you'll see a ancient Christian symbol, the fish, carved into one of the stones in ancient Ephesus. There was an underground Christian church there.
Well, to counter my own counter here, if you will, you also brought up the discussion about how one of the Roman historians, had something written down about how Jesus's death, that there was basically an eclipse, that the earth shook, and I think, I could be wrong, but I think the Gospels also nod to something of that effect occurring. Do they not? Yeah,
the Gospels. So what Tallis wrote affirms the Old Testament. And so, I don't know what you do with this. So his intention was not to write about Christianity. So it was an aside. It was an important moment, in this time of that he's trying to recount historically as an early Roman historian. And what he describes and what I already read here, of course, really does bear out that not only are these assertions from the Gospels, but we have secular, non-believing historians on the outside without any reason to bring this up here, other than it was a stark moment in time. It really does seem to affirm, what we believe and know.
Right. So then the other argument I would bring from the other side of this is that the things that you're saying, okay, we'll accept that they're valid, arguing the Socratic method here. We'll accept that they're valid and that they acknowledge that Christians existed, and that's what a lot of these historians seem to do. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everything we see in the Gospels and everything Jesus did, all the miracles, doesn't mean all of that is necessarily true. So how would you respond to that?
I would respond just generally here. So, we have these contemporary and near contemporary sources, affirming. So, when, as an aside, one of the historians writes about the Jewish people under the reign of Claudius being kicked out of Rome, that's just a brief comment made in the book of Acts. So a couple of Paul's friends, oh man, I can't remember their names. Help me out.
Are you thinking Aquila, Priscilla?
Yes, okay. Yes, thank you. Aquila and Priscilla were kicked out of Rome during the time of Claudius, so they ended up joining St. Paul, of course. So eventually, the Jews, when Claudius died and Nero comes in, the Jews would eventually come back, and the persecution would go down. But this is just an aside. It's like, wow, I mean, this is a brief comment about Aquila and Priscilla, and Gaius Suetonius goes, yeah, it did happen. So I just, whether you or not you want to believe is different, but you have to acknowledge that the Old and New Testament is a reliable, viable, ancient text that can be confirmed by contemporary and near contemporary sources. And, outright being I'd say ignorant American saying, I don't believe Jesus. I had a comment, in fact, on Twitter the other day. And someone's like, Jesus was a fabric of people's imagination. How can you even say that? He is a historic person.
Yeah.
Whether you submit to him as Lord and Savior is something different, but you have to acknowledge his existence based off the evidence that's out there.
Well, I might be a little bit ignorant here, but most Muslims even acknowledge Jesus existed and performed miracles. Yes, they acknowledge him as a prophet. You can correct me if I'm wrong, since you have more life experience.
And you were there. We went in Jerusalem, went to a jewelry shop, and we're thinking about buying jewelry off of this one Muslim merchant, and because of course I believe in Jesus, he did exist, and I'm just thinking, even if he doesn't accept him, as Lord and Savior, he knows his story. He's surrounded by evidence of his existence, and you can't deny this. Whether it's one thing. Let's be honest about it out there. This is largely a secular audience here, so if you don't. want to accept, him as the way Christians do, at least be honest with yourself and say, yeah, of course he existed. Historically, you can't deny that. We have secular pagan Roman historians even mentioning him by name. So yes, he existed. What you do with him is a whole thing altogether. And yes, the Muslims say he's the greatest prophet, and what have you. They deny, of course, his death and resurrection. That's a whole different thing.
Yeah. Well, that being said, Trace, I'll give you the final word before we take a brief ad pause here. Then we'll do some Q&A, and then we'll turn this into a two-parter.
Episode 88.
I mean, I think you hit on everything there. I don't think I can really add too much else to it.
Great. A nice, thorough, robust argument. I love it. So we're going to take a brief ad break. I saw some questions I've been jotting down. I'm going to see if there's any more. So for those of you watching on the live, if you have any questions, send them in like right now so I can look at them real quick, jot them down, and we'll ask them. But for those of you that are listening post-fact on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, whatever your poison is for podcasting platforms, we'll be right back.
All right, we are back. We got our questions. We're in the last leg of this episode here. We're going to try and finish this up and then make it a two-parter.
So these are some broad questions here to ask. It's just two. This is a broad question. Is the past being hidden? And then the person that sent this question also says that they believe a global flood happened, and did the flood erase history? So I'll direct those to you, and then I'll throw my comments from our previous episodes on there.
Well, this is really more up your alley here, the global flood. 'Cause you've been studying this for, I'd say, at least a decade plus.
All right, well, let's say, is the past being hidden? Is there a deeper past? And we'll probably talk about this more on the next part, but is there a deeper past that you think is being hidden, that is being overlooked by academia and science altogether because it doesn't quite fit their narrative and their model? They're trying to take the facts and make them fit their model rather than take the model and make it fit the facts.
Yeah, I mean, obviously a global flood would I would not say erase, but cover up or destroy, obviously, any pre-flood civilizations that may have existed. Well, that did exist. That's a fact.
Yeah.
And so but then it creates its own history. We see, millions of dead things laid down in rock later scattered all around the world.
Great Answers in Genesis quote right there. I'm gonna have to cite them now for that. Thank you.
And I love when Ken Ham talks about, so what do you see, when you're doing archaeology? Because millions of dead things buried in rock layers scattered all around the world. I mean, so that would of course bring out a global flood.
So here's something else I'll throw in real quick too. We're going to talk about this on the next episode, but you have done a good bit of archaeology yourself. Now, more recent than like digging up fossils, but you've done your fair share of archaeology, and we're definitely going to talk about those experiences and what all that has to offer to add to your credentials here, in a sense, into this conversation. But to circle back to the questions, is the past being hidden? That's the whole point of this podcast right here, is to analyze and to ask the question. That's why we're analyzing the mysteries of the world, and we're trying to detect what that underlying theme is in mythology. We're trying to pick that out because, my whole inspiration... Okay, I need to be careful saying my whole inspiration, because there's so many inspirations that play into this podcast. One of my big inspirations here is the dialogues of Critias and Timaeus coming from Plato. And that's where we get the Atlantis story. And so automatically a whole bunch of you are just like, oh, this went from history to pseudo-history. No, Atlantis is actually mentioned by in the Plato dialogues. So there's no question of it at least being mentioned historically. We have validity of that. But the idea of Atlantis is that there is stuff further in our past, and that there were calamities that covered a lot of things up. That was the first one. You see this very clearly being outlined in the whole Critias and Timaeus dialogue, is that Atlantis is wiped out by this massive sea event. And you even see, depending on how you read it, it's likely that there is way pre-Columbus knowledge of North and South America in the Atlantis dialogues as well, which is mind-blowing to me if you look at these accounts and how people want to dismiss it. So is the past being hidden? I mean, maybe to some degree unintentionally. Did the flood erase history? Yes, it definitely would have. If a global flood did indeed occur, it would absolutely erase large portions of history. Just as Atlantis would have been destroyed post-flood, if you read the Atlantis dialogue as being a literary account, it would have happened post-flood. But so yeah, let's dive a little bit deeper into that real quick as we wrap up the show. Plato gets his account from a Greek political figure. Shocker, that's a Greek involved in politics. And
Yeah.
this Greek political figure gets into political trouble. Another big shocker for Greece. And so he runs off to Egypt and he talks to these Egyptian priests. And he gets the story of Atlantis from these Egyptian priests. And these priests tell him this really cool story about the myth that these Greeks had about how the sun god, S-U-N, like the Bob, big orange ball in the sky, sun god, had a son, S-O-N, that borrowed the sun chariot, S-U-N chariot, and rode it too close to the earth, and it burned up a portion of the earth. It's more or less the effect here. And the Egyptian priests tell this Greek political figure, they're like, this has the appearance of myth, but it's actually a true account. It's talking about the declination of heavenly bodies. It's a real story. It really happened. You guys have just convoluted it in myth because you've experienced all these calamities. You lost your ability to write. And so this truth got ingrained into myth. And so I read this, I don't know, like 5-6 years ago. And I started asking the question, like, what else has been ingrained into myth that history has to offer? And so that's why we have you here, Colonel, is to help us analyze with your PhD in history, to analyze the Bible, to finish up this conversation of analyzing, I'm going to say mythology of the Bible. That doesn't mean that I'm saying the Bible is true or false. Mythology is any account, as we talked about previously, Trace. It's any account that talks about a religious occurrence or something to that effect. So the mythology of the Bible, whether the mythology of the Bible is true or false, and then to apply this more broadly. So we'll finish up next episode our conversation on the Bible itself, and then we're going to broaden our sites and look at historical documents, and then broaden to some other topics as well. I'll give it over to, I guess, Trace. I'll let you say anything else you have to say, then I'll give it to guests for final thoughts.
I had a thought, but it just left me.
Hate when that happens.
Yeah, I can't remember.
All right. Well, Colonel, over to you. What else do you have for us before I close this out?
I mean, to wrap it up here, so it's a stool that I'm building with 3 legs on it, and these legs are my argument. So this is a very Socratic approach, a very logical Greek-based approach, which I'm trained in. And so the first leg, of course, how close are the sources to the event? And I discussed, of course, that we accept that Julius Caesar, the conquest of Gaul, was his work, even though the sources we have closest to him were 1,000 years old. So, republications, we'll say in modern terms, 1,000 years later, but no problem, it's Caesar's. Thucydides, the Peloponnesian Wars, 1,300 years after Thucydides died, but nobody questions that he was the author. And so I demonstrated for the Old and New Testaments here that we have sources that are contemporary or near contemporary, such as the St. John fragment that I keep on holding up here. You can see it, going back to near contemporary. It's a parchment in Greek found in Egypt. It's John chapter 18 in modern terms. Once again, the chapters didn't exist back then, but if we match them up, and guess what? The translation is pretty accurate too. So that was the first leg. Second leg, of course, was outside contemporary sources. We talked about Suetonius and Flavius Josephus and many others who recorded aspects of Christianity or Jesus or the life of Jesus that were not Christians, didn't have that bias, and it was just part of their general history as ancient Greek or ancient Roman historians. That bears up the sources, and none of their citations dispute or contradict what we're reading in Book of Acts or the Gospels or the letters of Paul. And the last leg for the next episode is, what does archaeology say? What does tangible, hard rock evidence say about this whole topic?
To be a good historian, you got to get out of the library. I hope I don't get copyrighted for that. It's a great quote from Indiana Jones 4. It's the Crystal Skull, right? That's what the official title is in Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull, right?
That's one of. I don't know if
that
that quote is from that exact one.
It's from that one. It's right after they crash into the library with Mutt Williams.
Oh, yeah.
So it's from that one. Yeah. That's a good one. All right. So that being said, we're close to closing out here. So usually what we do on the show before we close out is we do a creature fact. I'm stealing your creature fact.
That's fine.
You're not getting it because Trace, for those of you who don't know, he's studying to be a marine biologist. He stole a whole episode 3 episodes ago now for whales. He talked about whales for a whole episode, and he actually made it pretty interesting. So I was actually pretty interested, especially listening to it like the second time. I was like, yeah, this is really good. So you did a good job, man. I'm proud of you. But that being said, I'm going to steal your creature/cryptid fact, And I'm going to get a little personal here. I know this cryptid exists and is real because I've seen it with my own 2 eyes. I'm going to be talking about the one and only Jersey Devil. They're both laughing because they know this story well from our time in Boy Scout trail life experiences of camping and telling campfire stories. But I have indeed myself seen the Jersey Devil. So, I got my Bigfoot shirt here because I'm a believer in the Jersey Devil at the very least. All right. So there we were in the Argonne Forest in France doing some archaeological research, which we will get into next episode. And my dad was there and he saw this as well. So I have a reliable academic witness for this account. And we're at the site. We're finishing up. We're celebrating a little bit because we just found what we were looking for very recently. Yep. And it was a celebratory evening as we're wrapping up on the site, getting ready to head over to our hotel. And before we leave the woods, the Argonne Forest is very dense, it's very scary. It's getting dark out. It's like that time at dusk where your eyes can start playing a little bit of tricks on you. And we're standing there, and then just out in the woods, we hear this. And I'm like a kid at the time. So I look at my dad. I'm like, Dad, what was that? He's like, oh, it's a Jersey Devil. Like, okay. So then after a little bit of time, we hear it again. And I'm like, all right, can we go, please?
You're like, okay, guys, there's 3 adults. Okay, guys, I'm serious. We need to leave now.
I'm 8 years old. I'm scared of the Jersey Devil. It's in my defense. Hadn't learned martial arts yet for our avid listeners. So eventually we load up and we start heading out. It's a long ride out of the forest on a very beaten down farm road. It's pitch black now, mind you, by the time we're getting out of the Argonne. And we just start pulling out of the main dense forest and into some passing through some farm fields on this road. And ahead of us at about, 300 feet, there's this white shriveled face just floating in the middle of the road. I'm not making this up. Actually happened.
Turning my high beams on, like, what the heck is that?
Yeah, because you're driving. You turn the high beams on and it's still there. It's just floating and then kind of bobbing a little bit in the middle of the road. And so I'm freaking out in the car. Again, 8 years old. I'm like, it's a Jersey Devil. We're all going to die. Ah! So we inch closer and closer. It doesn't go anywhere. It's not a figment of our imagination. It is indeed really there. And eventually we get close enough and we see that's a black and white cow that got separated from its herd and it was calling for help. And those were the haunting calls that we heard in the darkness. So I have indeed seen the Jersey Devil, and I can confirm it's a cow. All right. Well, thank you for tuning in, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, conspiracy theorists, all of you out there, whether you listened on live or whether you're listening post-fact on Spotify, YouTube, or your podcasting poison of choice. We thank you for listening on the earth, above the earth, and below the earth to Musings on Mysteries in the Mythical Matrix. We invite you to quantumly transcend time with us and correspond with us on this episode, because you can get a hold of us at m.quad.musings@gmail.com. That's m.quad.musings@gmail.com. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok at m.quad.musings. And you can find us on Facebook, Musings on Mysteries, and the Mythical Matrix -mquad. That is us. You'll know it's us because you'll see the Phoenix logo. We invite you to quantumly send in your confessions, concessions, contentions, snide remarks, whatever you have to add to this episode, as we plan that this is an ongoing conversation as long as we have the podcast live. So we have no problem circling back, asking our guest to return at some point if we have enough questions specifically for him. And I'm sure he would have no problem with that. But yeah, thank you for tuning in. And we hope that you have a good night.
Toodles.